way. We're going to post it onto YouTube. And if you don't want to appear on video, which is totally fine, but you have a question, you can type it into the chat, and either Rachel and I will pose it there at the end, or if you do want to be recorded, you can let us know, and we'd be happy to unmute you and let you on. All right, so I have been really looking forward to tonight's event. We are delighted to welcome to Northshire Live Dr. Larry Ward and Kazu Haga. Today is the launch of Larry Ward's new book, America's Racial Karma, An Invitation to Heal. Dr. Ward is a senior Dharma teacher in the Plum Village tradition, ordained by Nhat Hanh. He brings 25 years of experience in organizational change and local community renewal in 20 countries to his work as director of the Lotus Institute and as an advisor to the Executive Mind Leadership Institute at the Drucker School of Management in California. Dr. Ward holds a PhD in religious studies with an emphasis on Buddhism and research on the neuroscience of meditation. He has committed his life to nonviolent social change, healing, and transformation at all levels, from individuals and communities to the global scale. Joining Dr. Ward today is Kazu Haga, author of Healing Resistance, a radically different response to harm. Northshire Bookstore was going to host Kazu for an in-person event, but 2020, of course, had different plans. The silver lining, though, to that is that we can transcend geography with events like this today. Kazu is the founder of the East Point Peace Academy and one of the most experienced trainers in Kingian nonviolence, a leading voice nationally in various approaches to nonviolence, organizing, and restorative justice. He works to empower incarcerated communities, youth, and activists. In Healing Resistance, he blazingly reclaims the energy and assertiveness of nonviolent practice and proves that nonviolent civil resistance remains the most effective strategy for social change in hostile times. Please welcome to Northshire Live, Kazu Haga and Dr. Larry Ward. So, Larry, could you please tell us a little bit about America's Racial Healing, about your new book?
Well, the book, of course, like all books, at least for me, has been in a lifetime in making. And in particular, I started with this idea of America's racial karma 15 years ago when I was living in Asheville, North Carolina, and driving around the South. Not for the first time. I was there in the 60s. I can tell stories about that. But something happened during a drive there on the way to see a friend of mine who was a professor at the University of North Carolina, retired professor who had just written a book on hanging and justice in the state. And she's an old friend of ours. She's a practitioner of meditation and mindfulness. And we went to meet her to say hi. We're in North Carolina now and have breakfast, walk around the campus. The drive changed my life. And what changed was a deeper question. What makes the notion of white supremacy so intractable, so persistent, so, as my mother would say, so devilish? And what makes this idea, which is got no scientific meaning, given the sense that, our genetic code, our skin tones are such a tiny part of our genetic code, I ask myself, how could such a tiny thing, in fact, in science, become such a huge political success? And so the book is about my meditation on how that occurs. And the word karma is an old word from in India and Sanskrit, and it means action. But I titled the book the way I did because what I know and have learned from my own practice and study and from my teacher is that actions that do not get changed continue. The sheer momentum. And the same is true with our own neurological systems, which is how habits get developed. So when I saw that, then I asked myself, what is the action deep inside of someone that supports the continuation of this notion of white supremacy and its social, ecological, political consequences. So the book is a short, which is not easy to make it short, a short introduction of how one could begin to look at this. So that's what I would say now.
Thank you, Larry. And I'll just share a few words about my book. But today is the release of Larry's book, so most of our conversation will be focused on his work. But just a few words about healing resistance. I've had the great privilege in my life to spend a lot of time with elders from the civil rights movement and people who were very close with Dr. Martin Luther King, and was mentored largely by a gentleman by the name of Dr. Bernard Lafayette, who was on Dr. King's senior staff. And he taught me, you know, almost everything I know about nonviolence. My path actually started in Buddhism. When I was 17 years old, I ended up reading a book called Living Buddha, Living Christ by Thich Nhat Hanh, one of his older ones. And then I ended up spending a year and a half in Buddhist monastery with a Japanese Buddhist order that was really committed to nonviolence and social change work. But about 10 years into that path, I discovered this philosophy called Kingian nonviolence conflict reconciliation, and it completely changed my life and my understanding of how we relate to conflict and change in our society. And I found that, you know, my 20 years in this work, there's been this tension of being in a lot of spiritual communities and being in a lot of communities that are working on self-transformation and trauma healing, where there's incredible work happening at the personal level, but it doesn't always translate to action to change systemic causes that are causing the personal harms. And then oftentimes when I go to social movement spaces, we're creating policy changes, but then kind of perpetuating the traumas within our own communities. And I've always wanted to see a movement that is able to bring those two things together. And specifically, you know, having noticed that like the levels of harm in our society are so great that our responses to that harm has to escalate along with it. But noticing in my path in nonviolent direct action work that oftentimes the more we escalate our tactics of resistance, the more we escalate this black, white, us versus them, right versus wrong worldview, which is kind of at the heart of what is destroying this planet. And so my path has really been about exploring how we can build a movement that kind of matches the escalation of the harm that is out there, but doubles down on a commitment to healing and reconciliation and bringing together beloved community. So really honored to share this space with Larry today and talk about his book, which I got a chance to read. I got an advanced copy of. And I was telling Larry that it's a book that I ended up reading the entire thing in a day. And I'm also beginning my second read through it because, you know, I wanted to like read it all before this event so that I could be prepared, but it's also a book that like deserves slow reading and integrating every word in every section. So I'm really grateful that you're able to write such a book that has so much wisdom that's also very accessible. And if you wanted to, you could read in a day, because that is a really difficult thing to do. But I'm curious to start the conversation, Larry. Before jumping into the content of the book, I noticed as I was reading through it that this is the first book that I read that actually named the coronavirus pandemic and that named George Floyd and had his name in the pages. And I'm just curious what it was like for you to be writing in these times when things are changing so fast and there's so many conversations, particularly around race, writing a book like America's Racial Karma, just your experience of what that was like for you.
For me, writing the book was a chance to reprocess all my own personal trauma around race. And what I appreciated about the opportunity, as difficult as it was on some days, is I have the skills to do that. And those skills from meditation, from mindfulness, from trauma resiliency training, and from social action for me are never separated. And I think if we look at history, which I know most Americans have a short framework for, but if we look at history beyond this, and even in American history, you will see no significant social change has ever occurred without a spiritual foundation. And we can see, as Kazu is reminding us, without that spiritual foundation, our social change ends up relapsing and reactivating our own trauma that we're trying to change. So for me, I'm trying to get past. I'm at an Airbnb at a friend's because we just relocated to California, and one of the delightful people here is from Israel, and he and I've been chatting and eating together, etc. And he asked me if I thought things could be fixed. And from that point of view, Gracely Boggs comes to my mind. And one of the things she says, we must keep our eyes focused on the immediate needs, what needs to be done in the here and now to mediate suffering, stop violence, etc. But we also must think long term. Otherwise, 2 years from now, we'll have the same story. I mean, if you look back through American history, you can see the pattern that I call America's racial karma. Someone's killed, someone's abused, there's a riot, the police move in, more people are killed. And this, I've lived through this over and over again in my lifetime, let alone looking back over the last 300 years. That pattern is consistent, and the tragedy is just totally predictable. And so how do we get out of that? It's not serving our interests as human beings. It's not serving our interests as a nation, to use that framework. It's just compounding tragedy. And so for me, there's work I have to do inside of myself, to use a Buddhist language, to understand how my mental thoughts have been conditioned about race. So I can recognize them when they're coming up. And I've had people write me and says, I was thinking about this and I realized this isn't my thought at all. This is my uncle's thought. So this is my society's thought. And so we have to really recognize what conditioning we have and then practice to decondition ourselves. So as we reimagine the future, we don't bring baggage we don't need.
Thank you. So yeah, with that, I'd love to jump into it. And you mentioned just a few minutes ago that your understanding of karma simply means action. And I think, people in this country have many different understandings of the word karma. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to it, and then specifically what you mean when you say America's racial karma. Okay,
so I know in the US anyway, there's like karma dog food, there's karma bars. I mean, in the commercialized marketing world, no language is immune from being captured by the zeal of marketing. So, but karma, the simple translation is action. And in particular, I focus this book on 3 types of actions: the action of thinking, the action of speech or the action of language, and the action of physical behaviors. And those 3 actions are consistent in the teachings in Buddhism, whether it's Kukai from Japan or other resources of Buddhism. But those actions shape our human experience, and those actions create other actions that we then spend our lives reacting to. And so there's this circle of reactivity around race that if we don't learn how to break through, it won't change, at least at a systemic level. So I'm not talking about whether simply I'm an awake person, whatever that would mean. I'm talking about the quality of the environment that we live in as human beings in a society. And that quality for me is grounded in nonviolence. And I really appreciate your understanding of nonviolence, which is a lifestyle. I mean, when I learned it in India, when I was there a few years practicing and learning and working in villages, that the story that people had in villages about Martin Luther King and about Gandhi was, this is a lifestyle. It is not simply what to do when there's conflict. It's what to do to avoid conflict happening in the first place. And then it also can help resolve and heal. But it's a lifestyle, it's a meaningful lifestyle. And that's difficult in a culture that in some ways is addicted to violence. And so I think I understand the book is like a first step, not a last step in a journey. And so we are worked on a pathway of training, which we're just going to be putting up on our website to take a journey if one decides to. So I decided that was important so that every day we can understand, how am I thinking about this? What's my language around race? What's my physical behavior? I mean, if you want to look at physical behavior as action of karma, look at segregation. Physical behavior is action. And whether that's going towards something or going away from something, that is still physical action. The signs at the water fountains, I mean, none of this to me is very abstract. It's all very, very mundane. Ask children who go to school who get called names if this is not mundane, if this is not daily life experience in terms of how they experience actions of others and the actions inside of themselves as they try to handle or cope with the suffering they may be experiencing.
In the book, you talk about bending the trajectory of America's racial karma. And of course, we know that the history of race on this land starts with the genocide of indigenous peoples, the enslavement of African peoples, and that's kind of the trajectory that we've been on. But we've also had other inputs into that trajectory, the abolitionist movement, the civil rights movement, the current racial justice movement, Standing Rock, all of these. So given all of these inputs, where do you see the trajectory that we are on now? And what does it mean? What does it look like to bend that trajectory?
Well, I know Reverend Angel today gave a talk on whether there's going to be preparing for civil war, preparing for not civil war. And I think for me, the question of trajectory is a question of where I'm going to put my energy. So trajectory of anything and action and karma all runs as energy. And so I think our challenge in that regard is learning how to heal ourselves enough while at the same time we reimagine what it means to live together. I think we have to do both at the same time. There's not time to wait for all of us to feel like we're well, or for all of us to actually be well in our own minds to heal ourselves. Healing is a journey. We don't have to have been perfected, as Thich Nhat Hanh would remind us, to learn to live in the Pure Land, to learn to live in the kingdom of heaven in the present moment. So we drop out of ideology and into existential experience. For me, we have a tremendous opportunity. People around the world are waking up around this whole race issue, which I never thought I'd see in my lifetime. It's so profound. Notes from Japan, from Thailand, and protests in March in Germany and France, around the world. So there's a kind of shift here that for me is a different kind of trajectory. And it's a trajectory beyond politics. It's a human trajectory. It is the faces we see here and what we do in our communication with one another, how we work together, how we partner, how we create projects, how we do art, how we do music, how we do business together without codependency on ideology. And I think that's really the challenge for us who've been conditioned so well throughout our lives to have certain ways of thinking about what's good and what's bad and what I can do and what I can't do and what I can think about and what I can't think about. And I think a wonderful way to think about, for me, was the trajectory I see is a path of healing and illumination and imagination. So when I work with school teachers from time to time, I ask, yes, I know the school system is not perfect, but what I really want to know is, what kind of school system do you want? What can you imagine for your children, for your teachers, for your parents? If we stay fixated on what's not working, we will not survive. Another way to say, we must move past the first noble truth while not forgetting about it, and go and work all the noble truths at the same time. It's so easy to get stuck in suffering that we don't see the doorway suffering's opening for us. The path of liberation, our suffering is opening. So I see a trajectory. I see a movement around the world where people are standing up for one another in new ways. It's in every continent. But we have, I'm going to say it this, we have a political system that is around the world that is out of touch. That's the most polite way I can say it. Concretely, it's out of touch with the people living on this planet. I listen to people. It doesn't matter to me what spectrum they're from. They're in their heads. Meanwhile, we got children in real cages. We have people really homeless, really killed and abused, and we're into ideology. So my trajectory is to break beyond that, break out of that pattern. And I know whatever new ideology we create won't be perfect. And 100 years from now, somebody will go, oh, well, we got to change that. So it's understanding that we live in a flow of society. The Dharma is a flow. It's not a book. It's a lived experience. It's lived teachings. And so for me, the trajectory has to be putting our energy into one another. I've so enjoyed being here. There's another young man from New Zealand here in the Airbnb, and he's also a great chef. And so it's just the experience we've been having here for a week doesn't fit any categories, except we've been happy, we've been well fed, we've been well respected, we had a lot of laughter, we had a lot of cheers. We got to be human together and not defined by top-down categories. So for me, the trajectory is to get beyond the defining of us of top-down categories. So the next class, online class I'm working on is called Decolonializing Our Minds. Because that's part of what we're all dealing with, whoever we think we are, however we identify. We have impressions from the colonial heritage we all have about gender, about males, about females, about color, about what's the purpose of life? How do you know you led a good life? So to me, we have to revisit those things and answer from within. That to me is the trajectory I'm going to put my energy into.
Thank you. There's so many threads that I want to pick up on everything you just said. So let's start here. You just mentioned the Four Noble Truths, and specifically the first noble truth of dukkha, oftentimes translated as suffering or unsatisfactoriness. When I started studying Buddhism 20 years ago, that was one of the first things you learn, of course. It's the first noble truth. And when I heard it, I was like, okay, life is filled with suffering, unsatisfactoriness, got it, check, next thing. And then about 18 years later, it finally hit me. Oh my God. And I think we're living in a time when a lot of people are awakening to that truth.
Yeah.
And it's easy to sink so deep into life is filled with suffering that we forget that the Buddha also taught that there's a pathway outside of that. So when we get stuck in life is suffering, life is unsatisfactory, everything is scary. What are some practices and some tips for people to just get through a moment of so much suffering in this world?
Well, one resource I found extremely helpful, I have an academic background. So this is a book, but it's a book written by somebody I've met. And it's called Why Buddhism is True. And my wife and I lived on Vashon Island near the Zen temple there. So we used to attend there, and he came to give a talk, and we got to go to dinner with Robert. And he's a scientist, and he describes the Four Noble Truths from a scientific and evolutionary point of view. And his point of view about suffering from evolution is if we didn't suffer, we would not grow and change. We are wired by evolution to be dissatisfied, so we adapt so that we learn. It's not meant to be some giant psychological rock sitting on our heads. It's an invitation to be alive. So I think some of the translation of the Four Noble Truths that came down, in every translation comes to a cultural context and an individual context. And so you have to remember a lot of the translation of Buddhism that came through the West or through India, you have to read it in the context of who wrote it. And you have to read it in the context of the times people were in. And so, there has been in religious traditions a preoccupation with suffering across the board because it's so obvious that it's an obvious human experience. But to stop there is to miss the point, to miss the opportunity of really being alive.
Yeah, it's really interesting because the First Noble Truth, which is oftentimes translated simply as like life is suffering, that statement translated through the lens of a Christian Protestant context and its understanding of suffering can really distort things. So I really appreciate that.
Well, the other thing to me is suffering. Well, that depends what you mean by suffering. So for me as a practitioner, suffering is about my relationship to suffering. Every morning before I get out of bed, I practice the 5 remembrances as a meditation. I'm of a nature to grow old. I have ill health, die, be separated from what I cherish, have accountability for my actions. And some people see that as suffering. I see that as waking up to the miracle of life. and so you're right, how things get framed. That's why we must take responsibility in new ways for our own dharma education. Otherwise, you can or Christian or Hindu, whatever religious tradition we're in. But Thich Nhat Hanh understands Buddhism as a humanistic tradition, really more than he understands it as a religious tradition in terms of practice. Of course, there's connections and there's bells and there's robes and chanting, all of which are wonderful practices. But as the Dalai Lama said recently, all those things are not the Dharma. They accompany the environment that can create an awareness of the Dharma that is living in us and is being taught to us, but they themselves, because once you meditate for a while, I learned I can sit in a perfect lotus position and actually not be meditating at all. So in terms of the actual practice of coming home to myself, dwelling in my body, recognizing my thoughts, my feelings, naming them, embracing them, learning how to let the negative ones go, learning how to reinforce the positive ones, and how I get in the way of my own transformation is really the shocking thing about meditation. So I think meditation is fundamental because if we understand it deeply, mindfulness of the body, for me at this moment, means creating the nervous system for the planet's future. Right now, we have a nervous system that's, quote unquote, served our species well enough to get us to where we are now. But our nervous system has come to the end of the road of what it can handle. Hence, we see what we see. And when that happens in a human being, uncertainty becomes so overwhelming. We turn toward fascism. We turn toward authoritarianism. We look for somebody to take charge and tell us what to do. The big change in the species is evolutionary for me. And Jonas Salk said this years ago, the most important thing a person can be doing right now is be conscious that we participate in the evolutionary process. And one of the questions I got recently from an article was, what does the 7 generations mean? And so it means for me, it means creating a nervous system that can support the next 7 generations of human beings and all other species. But if it is not clear that the way we currently have our nervous system wired and supported and rewarded is killing us all. So for me, the practice is not just incidental, it's not just interesting, it's not just to comfort me or help me calm down, it's to help me develop a nervous system capable of loving this whole planet and everyone on it. So for me, that's what the practice is about. And then how does that love, how does that equanimity, how does that compassion, loving kindness, joy show up in our collective existence? And one of the tragedies of America for me is we're one of the most unhappy places I've ever been. I've been around the world many times, and I'm always struck upon my return to the US of how re-traumatized I get just in re-entering. And I know this is true for you if you're paying attention to your nervous system's communications as you travel here, there, or somewhere else. But we live in this eggshell environment that's armed. And so without developing nervous systems capable of handling fear, imaginary threats, which our brain doesn't know isn't real, if we can't recognize our own minds, our own emotions, and learn how to handle and be with our emotional experience and with one another, for me, these are all the possibilities we have of transforming our world, because it's happening. I see it in Japan, I see it in Thailand, I see it in Botswana, I saw it in South Africa 2 years ago, in Mexico. I mean, it's global. Belarus is happening. And if you think all those people are going to turn around and go home tomorrow, we do not understand what's happening in our world, what the opportunity is.
Thank you for that. I'm wondering, we probably have about 5 or 6 minutes left before we open it up to a wider audience for questions and answers. And I'm wondering, one of the things that Buddhist practice has helped me with is being able to hold the paradox, because no one perspective has a domination on truth, and there's so many paradoxes right now of it's a moment of urgency, but we also need to move slow. Right. Even in conversations about race, the paradox that race is a made up thing and it has such real impact.
Exactly.
And I'm wondering if you could talk to how we're able to hold paradoxes in better ways, and maybe if you could lead us through just a short couple minutes of practice before we open it up for the audience.
Sure. For me, this practice, how I hold paradox and how I keep learning to hold paradox is through meditations on equanimity. And so I'll just take a moment and lead us in a short guided meditation, if that's okay. So now if you would make sure your feet are comfortable and you're connected to the earth, and you can feel that connection to the earth. And then find a way to kind of relax your shoulders, get your body in a position where you can love it with your breath for a few moments. And then if you would take your attention and bring it about 2 inches below your navel, and follow the in-breath and follow the out-breath. Follow the rising and the falling of the breath as a sensation. Feel when it contracts, feel when it releases. See if you can settle into that rhythm that's natural for you at this moment. Feeling your feet, your body connected, whether it's a chair or a cushion or a bed, and then you feel that connection to the earth. Let yourself rest in the solidity of the earth. The earth receives us. Births us, buries us, loves us through every breath. See if you can settle into the sensation of being loved by the earth through your breath. In-breath happening. The out-breath happening. Happening of the in-breath. Happening of the out-breath. Now see if you can let go of any effort you're making to do this and then just settle in to the miracle of your own breath. Your own body. Your own precious life. And see if you can increase the sense of space inside of your chest area. Around the lungs, around the heart. See if that can just open a little more. See if you can let go of any constraints that are just obvious at the moment there. As the breath flows through the whole body, through every cell. Thank you. That's probably enough on time, so.
Thank you so much. It's perhaps another paradox that breath is such a simple thing and yet one of the most important tools that we have access to, especially in these times. So I'll pass the mic back to the folks at the Northshire Bookstore, and maybe we can open it up for questions from the wider audience.
Sure.
Thank you both so much. There's a question already in the chat. Question for Larry from Marissa. How does one respond to the systemic evangelicalism, supposedly spiritually based, and the wrong concepts spouting from QAnon?
If you're asking me how I respond, I don't. I think what's really important right now is to decide where to place your energy. And because as societies change, as organizations change, are confronted with change or uncertainty, there's always a group of people you might call lead birds, early adapters, who are like willing to experiment, try new ideas, try new things. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have people who are never adapters. And these are people who define themselves by not changing. And what I have found, you know, if there's 100% of people, you got 10% on one end, 10% on the other, and these are just metaphors. But what I've discovered is the group of people in the middle will listen and follow whoever's energy becomes most prevalent. And so what I see in society and in companies when I consulted, or even in community organizations and villages where I've worked, is the temptation is to try to get the never adapters to change. And so people put all their energy trying to convince people that you're right or I'm right. And for me, that's a waste of energy. I mean, the latest research from the American Psychological Association, at least last year, concluded that no amount of information will change anyone's mind. But what will change someone's mind is experience. And so for me, the question is, how does that evangelical person you describe experience you? It's like when I discovered that if I want my wife to change, I have to change. It's like, oh, bummer. I thought they were just going to do what I wanted. So, I mean, we have the same thing in our society. So yeah, I don't worry about that. I consider that an aberration. As I look at history, I try to give a big picture. And then if there's something I have to deal with related to it, I will deal with it with as much equanimity as I have. But I've not even encountered that group except online, you know, because I do keep track and read news and etc. But I don't know enough about what that is to worry about it. That's kind of how I'm living every day. It doesn't mean you shouldn't worry about it. I'm just speaking from my time, my schedule, and what I have energy to focus on.
Thank you, Larry.
The other thing to mention is there's books. America is a very cultish society. We have a long history of weird things, groups, and and so do other parts of the world. So it's not like we are something special in that regard, but it's important to know we have this psychic tendency here in our culture for things like that to grab attention, grab hold of people's lives and interests and motivations. And, so I don't know enough about it to critique it. All I'm saying is that I don't have energy to put into learning enough about it to critique it.
Thank you. We've got a question here from Stephanie Barnes, and I'm going to unmute her, right? Wait, she would disappear. It moved on me. Hold on. I'm going to unmute her right now. Okay, Stephanie, you're still muted. Can you unmute?
Yeah. First of all, just thank you to Kazu and Larry. I really appreciate the discussion. And Larry, you probably already addressed my question. I wanted to share an experience very briefly that I had this last week. I am a Buddhist hospital chaplain in a Catholic hospital in the desert Southwest.
Okay.
And this last week, the director of my department said he was gonna lead a talk on racism and white privilege. And I went to this talk very enthusiastically and probably pretty naively. And the talk opened up with a prayer that was written by a priest from, I'm sorry, I'm a little shaky because this got me really angry.
Keep breathing. Go ahead.
Thank you. A priest from the 1600s, a Catholic priest, who rode slave ships and did conversions. And this was being held up as something very positive, and the prayer was offered from this priest. And the conversation kind of went downhill from there.
Yeah.
To the next person sharing, well, I think the problem in this country right now is that the young people have never seen segregation. So I won't go on anymore. I could give you more examples of the conversation. And I agree with you that as a Buddhist, like the best approach I have is to be the change, be the example. I did manage to say some things, and I have to confess that I was really happy to have a mask on.
Okay.
I was really relieved to have a mask on. But I'm just curious to know, like, I mean, you're not in that position, as I understand, either one of you, but how might you have responded? Like, I got sick to my stomach, I had rage, I had all those things, and I know how to use my practice to come to a place of equanimity, and I was able to speak from that place. But the impulse, part of me was like, I don't care if I get fired right now. Like, that was the position I started to be in. But I also know that that's not ultimately going to be the most helpful. So I don't know if you have any suggestions, either one of you, like how you might have addressed any of that, or maybe you wouldn't have addressed it at all, but I'd appreciate any thoughts that either one of you has. And I'll mute myself.
The thoughts I had while you were sharing is, and this is for all of us, we have to create a new narrative, not simply respond to the narrative being put in front of us. This is what I mean by getting caught in fixing things. So what is your narrative? Write it out, make it a poem, write a song, do a painting. And so I mean, how we think about things, how we speak, our language has to change. So where can you bring in your space new language that's affirmative of the human being, new thinking, new ways to think about things, new ways to imagine things, and new behaviors. So for example, when I was first in India working in villages, and the same thing happened in Africa, only the story's different, but India came to my mind. I was in a village named Sikor, North India, outside of Delhi, a couple of hours. It was cold in the winter. But I was in a tiny little hut, and we were there to do community development, meet with farmers and build plans, etc. And I noticed that people were making fire out of straw and cow dung. And that is what created fire to work in the little homemade ovens. I also noticed that the only people picking up cow dung and making straw patties were female. So the first morning I joined them. I didn't say a word to anybody. I just started picking up cow dung and making straw patties. This is what I mean by demonstration. I don't have to say this needs to change. In Africa and Kenya, when I was in Mombasa and village work there, I noticed the same thing. Every morning at 5, 6 o'clock, you had to go to the river to get water. Women were going to get the water every morning. The second morning I was there, I joined them. And after each occasion, I got pulled aside by the men in the village both in India and in Africa, and they said the same thing to me. Don't do that again. You're ruining it for us. And of course, then I had to do it again, and as long as I was there, and it began to shift the pattern. Because the village started talking about, oh, there's a man. Well, why can't you do it? So it's small things. We don't have to, Mother Teresa, great quote, doing small things with great love, rather than imagining how to do big things with no energy, is very powerful. So for me, how we think and creating new narratives, new stories about ourselves, our departments, our businesses, our communities, our relationships, new language to describe the world we want to live in, the kind of environment we want to live in, and behaviors that actually shift the pattern of supremacy, male top-down energy. So that's kind of what I've learned, and I keep learning to do. Thanks you.
Thank you. We've got a question here from Gordana. She said, what you said about healing the nervous system really resonated with her. Can you talk about healing our own nervous system, how healing our own nervous system contributes to healing America's nervous system?
This is difficult for Americans to understand because we've been so conditioned to think of ourselves as individuals. And we do not recognize, well, for one, your mirror neurons impact my mirror neurons. I mean, we have such a superficial understanding of what it means to be human that we don't even recognize how we impact each other in psychic space, in biological space, in neurological space. And so one of the things I appreciated from the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh was beginning to understand even the smallest thing you do in a space can impact the whole. And I mean, there's sutras that talk about how inside the very small is the large. And, I had a chance in my life to meet Rosa Parks by accident. I was at the World Council of Churches gathering in Detroit, where she was living in 1969. And the friend of mine, it was a group of ministers, and we all running around. Oh my God, there's Rosa Parks. And so I was looking up for this gigantic person. And they bring this tiny little woman, right? It's like, oh my goodness, she is gigantic to me. And her life is more than the bus story, of course. But my point here is we have been convinced by the white supremacy model that we don't have any power. I've even talked with people who are CEOs of Fortune 500 companies who say, I don't have any power. To which I say, you're really confused about your life. We all have power, personal power, position power, talent power, friend power, relations, and we need to use it to save each other. To me, that's the great work. We must save one another because our institutions are not capable of doing it. They don't know how. It's not that even if, like if you have the right directions, if you don't know how to drive a car, it won't help. So this is why the work on our nervous systems is so important, because as my nervous system changes, when you come in contact with me, your nervous system has to change to be with me. And that can be positive or negative. The chemicals that can get released, there was a great article recently on the efficacy of hate. And this person had looked at what part of the brain gets activated, what chemicals and hormones get released when people are hamped up on hatred. We also have chemicals that get released and they get empowered when we're happy and non-hating. But we need to understand our own biology at a much deeper level from a spiritual practice point of view, is what I'm trying to say. And because that becomes the scaffolding for me, of a new society. Thanks for the comment and question. It was great.
Well, I see that it's 6 right now, but we did start a little bit late, and there is one last question in the chat. So I'm hoping
Okay.
to ask this question real quick, and then we can be done. And this has been wonderful. And thank you both so much for today. But anyway, Celeste's question, it's another really good one. Question for Larry. Wondering if you have any reflections or advice on reconnecting to land or the ancestral way of being in relation to the land. She feels like, especially for Black or Indigenous folks who've been displaced and uprooted, their liberation is so deeply tied to the reclamation of land and ancestral practices. So she's wondering if you have any dreams or reflections on how we can do this, especially for folks who may not have easy access to this knowledge.
Yes, what you're saying is extremely important, because there's a part of us, and this is all of us, who will not know who we are unless we are in some ways connected to the land. Trying to know who we are by being connected to a mall, you're never gonna do it. Not possible. And so one of the, however small, one of the things I enjoy, we get to teach in Japan from time to time, and even the smallest place has some garden, some way to be connected to the vitality and the living reality of the earth. And so I know people are moving to farms, buying farms, creating farms. I'm in a friend's place right now. She has a little orchard next door with great tomatoes and some chickens. And so I think we have to figure out how to get closer physically to the natural world. I lived on a farm a few years ago, and I was astounded because, I never wanted to be a farmer, but I was astounded how healing it was to live where I was the smallest creature, where I was not the big dog, where the deer ran their own schedules, had their own babies at their own time, and where I started to learn to tell time based on what flowers opened in the day, and started to tell time in ways that is not dependent on the watch. So take a small experiment. And this is from our ancestors. 2 years ago, we were in Botswana in South Africa teaching, and people talked to us about the African spirituality. And so where I've been working is on how I integrate my own shamanic history, which I'm familiar with for many years, and both indigenous here in Africa and Celtic shamanism. It's all about being in the body and being with nature. So if you can find a program or some way to get more active in your experience of the natural world as sacred and precious. I just moved from Taos, New Mexico. In our front yard, we had this gathering of birds that kept growing and different species of bird that kept, hummingbirds and doves and sparrows. And they just kept coming. And so my neighbors said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Nothing, except meditating every morning and talking to all the trees and the bushes and the birds." I talk to everybody in the morning, and I guess they like that. So for me, that's fundamental. So not everybody has the capacity to have a farm or live on a farm. So I think we have to find new ways beyond the digital ways of being connected to the natural world. Otherwise, we won't know who we are or who we can be. And I have confidence in us knowing who we are and who we can be. And part of that confidence is you.
Larry, Kazu, thank you both so much. This has been a wonderful talk. Larry Ward's new book, America's Racial Karma, is out today. Kazu's book, Healing Resistance, is out last January, but we're still celebrating it. There's a pandemic. Thank you both so much. This has been wonderful.
Kazu, let's talk more how we might do something together. Appreciate your work.
I would love that. Thank you so much.
Okay, me too.
Thanks.
Take good care, everyone.
Take care. Have a great evening. Join us later for a couple more great events with Northshire Live. And thank you all so much.